Quick super fact: slavery was a choice because you either had the choice of death or work. But peep how the white man used death to keep slaves. So they would choose slavery. Africans of the time believed that when you died, you were resurrected to go back and be with your ancestors. So certain slaves chose to just die or run off or commit suicide to go back with their ancestors. There are no real taboos on suicide. What the slave masters would do is they would take the bodies and cremate them or destroy them or cut off the limbs of runaway slaves or slaves committed suicide to keep them from being able to resurrect and go back and be with their ancestors. So not only did the slave masters take their freedom, they also took away the freedom that they would have in death. And so that forced a lot of slaves to choose to stay in slavery. But nigga, what? And just to kind of add on to the point that I made before about slavery being a choice, understand that slavery started not in America. The process of becoming a slave, it didn't start when you got to America or got to Jamaica or got to somewhere in the Caribbean. Slavery started when you got to the shores in Africa. It actually started the moment that you might have got kidnapped from your village or taken as a prisoner of war. The process for you to become a slave started then. You were broken physically, mentally, and slaves are human beings. So through torture, people would capitulate. Women were raped. People were just broken down mentally, physically, spiritually, emotionally, linguistically unable to communicate with their fellow person because they were from a different tribe. And all that took place in Africa at the slave castles. So prior to you even getting to a place to get on your feet where you think slavery begins in America, and then you got all these choices that you can do, you're dealing with people that might have been in the slave castle in Ghana for 3 or 4 months, malnourished, being beaten, being psychologically tortured, and et cetera, et cetera. So their choices were actually quite few and slim. What you see in a lot of the revolts is certain slaves who were already either active. And just one final point with the choices, and I promise this is it. I'm gonna talk about no more. The difference between a slave that was brought over from Africa and somebody who was born into slavery, somebody who was a born slave. A born slave, they were born into the context of that's all that they knew. Their life was controlled from the time that they were born, what went into their mouths, what went into their brains, who they saw, who they could talk to, who was their role models. And if your role model is another slave, and that's what you see, and that's what you gain your impressions of how you should act and behave, then that's what you're going to kind of mimic. On top of all the other brainwashing and psychological warfare that took place in the mind of a slave. Now imagine just a baby or a child, right? A child seeing that. So when you think of slaves that were born slaves, mostly in America, because in the Caribbean, the Caribbean and South America, that slave trade was more about they had to keep bringing in new slaves because the conditions were so terrible at the mines or the plantations or whatever. They just kept dying. In America, you had people that actually bred slaves, right? Or slaves just naturally being married and having kids and having children in that circumstance, in that situation. And those children were brought up in an environment where they had no prior context, that there was a such thing as called freedom, because it was ingrained into them mentally that this is what they were and who they were and what their life was supposed to be, right? Reinforced through religion and all type of other situations to accept their circumstances, but they didn't really have any understanding or awareness of there was a potential outside of their circumstances. So just to end on that, slavery was a choice, but not what you think it was. You know what I'm saying? Be good to each other. Peace and much love to you. Super facts. What you see in a lot of the revolts is certain slaves who were already either active militarily to a certain degree, or were so ingrained. Think about Toussaint, right? In Haiti. Toussaint wouldn't have been able possibly to overthrow or have that revolt if he couldn't speak French. So you got somebody who already had to be incorporated inside of the society itself to even have the choice to revolt. Or overthrow the shackles of slavery in the face of all of the other kind of pieces and parts that go along with them becoming slaves. So understand that slaves are humans. They were subject to all type of torture. It wasn't as simple as when you got to America. Now you got the choice to either be this or be that. Your destiny was pretty much wrote out for you. And then understand a lot of these people that were slaves, rest in peace, they died. They didn't make it through their first 2 years. The lifespan of a slave, once you hit a plantation, was only a matter of a few years. In some cases, a few months, especially places like Brazil. So you got to take that into consideration as well, as how many choices do you have when you don't know what the outlook or what the future is. You don't know where you are. You run off where you're going to go. You can't swim, et cetera, et cetera. You don't know how to pilot a boat. There's a lot of factors which physically and environmentally occur for people to choose that type of lifestyle. It's no different than if you were put as a modern person put into those same positions today. No matter how radical or rebellious a gangster you think that you are, if somebody puts you in a position to be tortured, if that was the case, why do people stay in prison? Right? Because they can't get out that bitch. So, I mean, take all that in consideration and add that to the context. But still, nigga, what the fuck are you talking about?